For my projects, I usually start with the subject that I'm creating something for. So it's kind of closer to an advertisement because my subjects are almost always books. And it's usually about books that I've finished reading. And I have some idea of what themes I can use to create the project in the end. So in this tutorial specifically, I'm going to talk about my recent favorite project. By the time this tutorial is up, the video should be up on Instagram. So we have talked before about importing SVGs from Illustrator into Blender, but I also want to show you how you can create shapes directly in Blender. And we also talk again about optimizing your mesh. And then we're going to talk about what I believe is a new thing for this channel, and that is animating along a curve, but with the clamp to constraint, or with constraint in general, because I'm going to also talk about copy location and copy rotation. Well, technically I used copy transforms because I found it a little bit redundant to use copy location and copy rotation, but we can talk about that as well. Okay, let's get started. When I import SVGs from Illustrator, I usually have created them either using the shape tools or the pen tool. And sometimes I also like to use the pencil tool because it's a freeform pen tool kind of thing. And this is exactly what I do in Blender as well. So the first thing I do is add a curve, and I just add whatever. I always choose Bezier, and then I enter edit mode with the tab key. You don't need to select all because it's already selected, but in case you clicked outside, just click A and then it will select all, and just hit X to delete all vertices. And now you have a curve with nothing in it, and you're still in edit mode, so just hit 7 to go to the top view. And now we can start drawing. The thing I like to use is also the freehand pencil tool. But feel free to use the extrude if you have a vertex already. So just delete one of the vertices of the Bezier curve and then just hit extrude or E and then just extrude the shape that you want. But I like this because I want to hand draw the shapes. In that project specifically, I drew a heart. So let's draw a heart. And then I start fixing anything that needs to be fixed and delete any extra vertices that are very close to each other. Well, actually, I don't need to delete this one. I need to delete this. And then I need to join these two by going to curve and then toggle cyclic. Now I can also remove this vertex, and now I have just one vertex over here. In the original project, I didn't have to edit the hearts, but because I'm using a trackpad today, because my mouse was out of battery, so my drawing with a trackpad isn't that great. And then I just fix it. And I try to center the heart. So these center points, I try to put in the center. You don't need the points to be perfect because we're going to turn it into a mesh anyway, and it's going to create a multitude of vertices anyway to create this shape. And I'll also scale everything on the x-axis just a little bit. And we have a hand-drawn heart. Now if I go into object mode, oh, and by the way, if you don't remember the shortcuts, it's always G for move, S for scale, and R for rotate. So what I was doing over here is rotating some of the points, or some of the control points rather, and then I moved some of it as well with G, and finally I scaled it on the x-axis with S. And now let's go to object mode. If I hit the tab key, you can toggle between object mode and edit mode over and over again. And now I can convert it into a mesh. And if I go into edit mode with tab again, you can see the vertices that are creating the curves. So that's pretty much it for the hand drawing. Now we need to move into modeling this, or creating it as a model. The first thing that you need to do is have faces, right? Because right now we only have edges and vertices. And to have a face, or to create a face for all of these vertices and edges, you need to select all. So just hit A to select all, and then hit F. And that should give you a face for all these points. And if I move any of these points, it's already connected to the other ones with this face inside of it. And what's fun now is that I can extrude it and model it and bevel it however I want. But before I like to extrude, I turn on face orientation just to make sure that I'm extruding with the normal correctly facing outward. And now I hit E to extrude. And if I go down, you'll see that it's flipped as if we're looking at the inside, but I want it to be blue. So I go up, extrude it however much I want. Now after the extrudes, you'll find that all of the top edges are already selected, but I need to also select the bottom edges, only the perimeter. I don't want these ones. That's why I go to edge select mode instead of vertices, because vertices will select those as well. So by holding shift, I can double click on this edge and it's already all selected. And now I can bevel it. Just hit Command B for Mac or Control B for Windows. And if you hit C, you clamp it so it doesn't intersect. I found out this later than I liked because I always guessed and then I change it in the settings that appear once you click the bevel. And if you scroll up and down, you can increase the number of segments for the bevel. This is where I usually change the clamp overlap, but with C you can do that without going into the settings panel. You can also increase the segments over here for the bevel, but I do it with scroll up and down. Now we can go to the next step. Go out of edit mode, we can remove the face orientation, and we can rotate this as well. So if I hit tab, just so I don't have to apply transformation, I like to rotate it sometimes in edit mode. Select all with A, hit R for rotation, X for the X axis, and then 90 degrees for the mesh to face the front. So if I go and hit 1 instead of 7, now I can see the front view. And let's remove the camera from the viewport so we can actually see the heart. We can move on to modifiers now. As always, the first thing that I like to do to fix the topology of my mesh, especially with SVGs or something that I created with curves, the first thing I do to fix the topology for any simulations or if I wanted to sculpt the object is to remesh the model. So just go to add modifier, find remesh, you can search for it, but because I use it a lot, it's on my top searches. Go out of edit mode so you can see it happening. And then I choose between either voxel or smooth for something like this that I created a bevel for because I want to keep that smoothness. You can use sharp. Sometimes it does work in fixing or in adding that smoothness as well. But I prefer voxel, and I also like to turn on the wireframe from the viewport overlays over here, just so I can see how things look if I were in edit mode once I apply the remesh. I think I'll use the voxel because I think that's what I used for the object I have. And I tried to get it as smooth as possible without having too much geometry, but enough to be able to add a subdivision later and add some shading displacement or whatever you want to do. Okay, and once I have this mesh looking very smooth, I try it sometimes with subdivision. I wouldn't recommend trying it if you have too many faces or vertices in your object after the remesh because this will lag. And if you want to see the wireframe, someone helped me out in the comments and said that if I remove the optimal display, I can actually see how things are going to look like once I apply the subdivision as well. So I think this is enough to add any displacement and for it to look good. So I'm going to keep the subdivision. Honestly, I'm not going to apply it anyway, so it's fine. I just needed to see how things are going to look. And don't forget to apply smooth shading for the remesh. Okay, 0.015 is fine. And now let's apply it. Now we're ready to apply the remesh. Actually, before I apply the remesh, one thing I did as well is add a Boolean for the book. So if you have, let's say, cube, scale it down, and then scale it down on the y-axis as well. I'm just trying to make it resemble a book, so I can show you how I did it the first time around. And then I positioned it however I wanted. Now you don't have to do this right now, or before the remesh actually, because I want to have the UV unwrapping happen after the Boolean, and I don't want my animation to lag every time I try to look at it because of the Boolean. So I like to apply the Boolean, and I like to remesh after I apply the Boolean. So just move it inwards a bit so it can intersect with the heart. And then I added the Boolean to the heart. Don't think I have it over here, so let's just look for it. Now Boolean is right before the remesh. Choose the cube, and now we get to have that remesh after the cube is being removed from the heart. So if I hide the cube, we can actually see it happening over here. So all of my hearts actually have this Boolean, but don't have to create it with this Boolean. So I'm just going to remove it. It's not going to make a difference when it comes to the rest of the project. So I'm just gonna leave it as a regular heart. And I'm going to apply the mesh. So what I did in the first project is applied the Boolean first and then applied the remesh. And then I like to go into edit mode. Now we're going to UV unwrap it. And for me to do this, I like to cut my shape in half. I believe the best way to learn about UV unwrapping and optimizing the topology to work with physics simulation and different textures is by seeing it over and over again with different objects. Because the way I learned it is with practice. I didn't really know how to do a lot of the things before just watching YouTube tutorials, because no matter how much they try to explain how to UV unwrap something, it doesn't work with my object. Because the first thing that you're going to hear them say is, look for places where you can cut things. And maybe I've said this before in my UV unwrapping tutorial. Yeah, that's not the best advice for someone who's a beginner or who never really worked with UV unwrapping before and would like to learn how to do it for their textures to lie perfectly on the object or on their model. So yeah, I might do this over and over again for multiple tutorials, just so you know. So I have a front and a back because I know in my project I'm not going to see that back side, so I don't really care about it. So you can even cut it from the back and open it up as if you're doing that thing that we used to do as children. I don't really know what's it called, where you do a paper trail of hearts or of people that are attaching to each other. So that's kind of what you're trying to do if you want to slice it from the back. But I like to act as if I have a chocolate mold or as if I'm creating a plastic toy that requires two parts, a front and a back, to be stuck together. So this is what I want to do with this when it comes to UV unwrapping. So the first thing I do is hit 3 for a side view and then go into edit mode. And then I like to use the loop cut tool, which you can access through Command R as a shortcut, or you can just go over here and click on this tool to use it. And I try to look for a place where I can have a continuous line that is going to cut my shape into 2 halves. So it's not going to be a perfect half for the way I created this remesh. And technically, we do have a half already created, but it's not continuous. So you can see these lines going through the center. You can definitely click on those and use it as a seam for your UV unwrapping. But I just prefer to do it this way with the loop cut. And I'm going to cut it closer to the back rather than the front. And just hit escape because we don't really need to move it anywhere. I just need it in the center. And escape would do that. And then hit U, mark seam, and you get a seam for the UV unwrapping. And now I can select all with A, hit U for unwrap. And if I go to UV editing, I should have my heart. You don't have to do this, but I like to organize this by selecting the islands. Just rotate it by 90 degrees and then rotate this by negative 90 degrees and put them on top of each other. Scale it down a little bit. And now we have it in a way that is at least meeting at the top when it comes to the textures. And I can go back to layout. So we have created the hand-drawn model. We have optimized it for whatever simulation or whatever texture that we want to apply it to. Now it's time to animate it. And then I can show you how to apply some shaders from the asset library that I created. In the original video, I had an animation that resembled the bottom of a heart. So I added a curve, Bezier again, hit tab, select all with A, X to delete all vertices, and then I drew a shape that looked like this. Okay, let's draw it again. Okay, let's use smooth. You can hit O for proportional editing and just move it like so, just to clean up the curve a little bit. And now the fun part, we go to constraint. So just like modifiers, constraint are non-destructive ways to control the movement of an object. And to move things along the curve, you have a bunch of things that you can use. You can definitely use the modifier curve. That will also work, but it's a deformer, so it will deform the shape based on where it is on that curve. However, if you go to constraint, there are a bunch of things that you can use in order to move objects along a curve. One of them is follow path, but my favorite way for an animation that is very simple is the clamp to. So clamp to basically clamps or limits the movement of your object to the curve. So if I move it from left to right now before I constrain it on the x-axis, it'll move just freely. But if I select the curve as my target for this object, then if I hit G to move it from one point of the x to the other, it's constrained to that curve. So now I can just add regular keyframes to my X position and it will move along a curve rather than moving just freely on the x-axis. So this is a very easy way to move things on a curve, and it doesn't require anything other than just changing the curve that you have your shapes moving on, and the animation will still be the same. But if you add follow path, then the animation is occurring on that constraint itself, rather than on something that is attached to the shape itself, like this heart, for instance. So if I wanted to move it or animate it, I can just move it on the x-axis until it reaches the beginning of the curve, add a keyframe for location. If you just hover over the location and hit I, you can add one keyframe on where you are on the timeline. So I'm on 1. And then you can go to 40, just move it on the x-axis to the other side and hit I again on the location. And it's going to add a keyframe on frame 40 because we moved it to frame 40. And now if I hit shift and the left arrow, I can go to the beginning of the animation and we can view it. Of course, the animation is on Bezier, but you can make it linear, and you can definitely view only frames 1 to 40 by clicking this clock. If you don't want to change the animation duration of your render, then you don't change this end unless you have this preview range. So this is a way to limit your preview range without changing the number of frames that you want for your render. And now I can change this to 40, and this is just for viewing purposes for the viewport, so I can see how the animation works from 1 to 40. But if I just remove it, now I can actually see the entire animation, or I'm 100% sure that I'm not going to forget to render frames from 40 to 250 if that's my final range. So this is a good way for you to preview your animation or a part of an animation. Okay, but now we have a slight problem if you want to add objects to this object, like I did with my project, adding the books to the hearts. If I show the cube that we created to resemble a book, you're going to see that it doesn't move with the heart and it's very far away from the heart. I needed it to follow the animation without parenting to the heart because I just don't like parenting things simply to follow animation, because it'll make me just go through the hierarchy in order to select those objects. And it just makes things a little bit finicky and harder to navigate. And so I thought, why not just copy transforms? I never use that constraint. I always forget to use it. I finally remembered to use it here because it's a very useful constraint. Plus, I only like to parent things that are always together. So a book cover with its book content. And I know that I'm not going to ever go into that hierarchy to look for the children. I just want them to be together, but I want things to be separate because let's say I wanted to move the cover, I wanted to add armature to the cover, and I didn't want to parent, or I didn't want to make the inside of the book joined with the cover of the book. So I just had to parent it. In that scenario, I do parent. But when it comes to something like this, where I just need it to follow its location, I'm going to use the object constraint. And you have copy location, copy rotation, copy scale, and copy transforms. So if you want to only copy the scale, you don't really care about the other two things, then just use copy scale. But for me, I'm using copy location and rotation because I added a slight rotation with noise for the heart, and I wanted the book to follow that. So it's just much easier for me to control things when I have one constraint, because I'm going to have lots of books and lots of hearts. So I chose to use the copy transforms. Actually, I used copy location rotation for the majority of them, and then I realized that I could just use copy transform even if I never used the scale. And then use the heart as the target object. I haven't renamed any of the objects, so let's rename them. This is going to be the path. This is going to be the heart. And let's call this book. And now we're good to go. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to see is that the cube is just much bigger. We can apply the scale to make sure that it remembers its own scale, because once you apply it, it's all 1, 1, 1. So we're not really multiplying by anything or doing any weird calculations. And now I can rotate this and move it just like any child, just like you would with any child that is parented. Once you move the heart, everything is moving with it. But if you just move the child or the book, it's actually not going to move because we need to change the mix to before original. So now we're acting as if the heart is a parent. Let's actually 0 the rotations and move this book as if it were a child. If you want to scale something, but you don't want to scale it on a certain axis, you can hit scale. And then whatever axis you want to eliminate, you can just hit shift. And then for me, it's Y, and you can scale it on only two axes. So now for me, this is scaling only on the X and Z axes because I don't want the thickness to be changed, and that's on the Y axis. Now, if I move this heart, the book is moving with it. I don't have to add any keyframes to the book, and it's just following the animation over and over again. You can definitely increase this to, let's say, 80, and then copy this keyframe over here. So it's a looping animation. Now it's time for shading, so we can actually see how things look and if our UV unwrapping is correct. Instead of going to the shading editor at the moment, I'm going to open an asset browser in the layout panel. Doesn't really matter where you open it, but I'm going to open it in the layout workspace. I have a lot of materials. Most of them are Southern Shoddy's crafty assets. They're really helpful for the majority of my project, and you can actually see one of them being applied to the heart. They're also 4K textures, so they're very clear. Let's go to render view and remove all of the overlays so we can actually see things better. And you can see that immediately the texture was applied correctly because we have a good UV map. And if I look to the side over here, I can actually see the line where things split. But this is how you usually work with fabric. You have to have seams. You're gonna try to make the seams match. Doesn't matter what you choose to do, I don't really care. So especially with things like 3D, for the majority of time, I'm not going to see the backside of most of the things that I do because I don't do much rotations when it comes to animation. And that's for a reason, because most of the book covers that I have only have one face. I don't have a back cover or a spine for my books because I don't really have access to those sometimes, especially if I read the book digitally and I can only get the front covers from Google or wherever. So yeah, if you're ever wondering why I don't do a lot of rotations and seeing the back of things, is because of that. So I'm very much used to not caring too much about the backside of most of my meshes. And so I do cut a lot of things in half like this because I just don't care about the seams showing too much. But if you do, it won't matter that much as well if you do it correctly or if you do it in a way that you think looks best. For me, having a seam right in the center to cut the front and back of a mesh like this makes sense because this is how I would do it if I were to sew this in real life. Also, if it's plastic, to make a mold, you can definitely do, or the majority of plastics, you find some welding pattern on the edges because they had molds that they end up sticking together of the front and back. The same goes for chocolate, for instance. So seams are a natural thing in life, and it doesn't matter if it's showing in your projects as well. When it comes to texture paint, that's a little bit different because usually when you're painting, let's say, a plastic heart or a plastic egg, you're literally painting on those seams. So you can do the exact same thing with Blender. You can just UV unwrap it and then draw on those seams, and it will translate to those UV maps as a texture, and it'll apply without showing those seams. So your texture will overlap with the seam, making it a seamless texture basically. For this one, I'm going to go to my creative assets and I'm going to apply any of the assets. In the project file, I'm going to apply one of the assets and make it available with a project file purchase. But if you want the entire pack, you can definitely purchase it on its own. So if I, let's say, this wavy checker, it'll work fine. And then the displacement is also working perfectly because we have enough geometry for the displacement to work smoothly. And if I want to look at it how it's going to be rendered, then I can just increase the viewport to 2, and this is how it's going to look once it's rendered. And if I want to add those spikes as well, it's also going to work. Now let's go to the shading space so I can show you what you can do with these textures. Whenever I go to shading, I don't know why I haven't saved it with the default because I always do this. I just remove outline selected from the overlays because I don't want to see that selection as it will distort the view of how things are going to look. And now let's change some of the settings over here. So when it comes to the cell width and height for the spikes, I have it with a uniform value, so it becomes a uniform grid. But you can definitely just change one of those to be a different size to get a different look. And then if I change the spike in, spike out, I can actually make something that doesn't look like spikes. And then you can reduce the scale for the height of the spikes from the displacement. And you can change the materials for this object as many times as you want because you have a good UV. Now that we're done with this tutorial, let's actually take a look at the project so I can show you the lighting and how I create it and some of the assets that I created for that project. So for this year, I wanted to experiment a little bit with my setup and with my lighting because for the majority of my projects for last year, I only used an HDRI, a studio HDRI, and I never really changed it. I would add a few area lights here and there sometimes, but for the majority of it, I don't really touch the lighting. It's always the studio light HDRI as a default. Whenever I open a new file, that's the HDRI that exists there. So for this year, because I wanted to experiment with lighting, I had to use gobos, or I had to mimic gobos from photography. A gobo is basically a black and white image, and they have different images to add shadows to certain areas. So the light isn't just one spotlight or one area light, and it has some variations. They can have some lines added to it as if they had shutters on the windows. They can add some tree shapes, some leaves, whatever you want. But for this one, I used noise, and let me show you how it looks in render view. So it looks like a window is shining some light with some things that are shading certain areas on my floor and my walls. I already added a lot of texture with the models I have over here, but I wanted to add even more texture with the lighting. I watched this tutorial from Vincent Schwenk. I think that's how you pronounce his name, but he works in Cinema 4D. I have subscribed to his Patreon before, but I never subscribed for a long time because I knew I would never work with Cinema 4D or Redshift, but I wanted to know some of his techniques and ways of looking at it, or his way of looking at 3D art. I would highly recommend his Patreon if you want to know more about 3D. You don't really have to follow his tutorials. You don't really have to download Cinema 4D. You can just apply the same principles in Blender, and that's what I did exactly. I learned from him how to add some texture to your plastic elements, how to light up a scene, but he also has some free tutorials on YouTube if you want to look at those. And this is one of his tutorials that I followed to a T actually, but instead of using Cinema 4D and Redshift, I used Blender. And if you watched that tutorial and you still didn't know how to create this light in Blender, you can go to the shading area. Just go to the light, the area light that you have. And this is basically my setup. So you can actually select the area light, and then if you choose use nodes, then you'll get this toggle that you can edit from here, or you can go to the shader editor and edit it from there. It's going to be one of the objects. You don't even have to change this to a world or light or anything like that. You can just select the light object that you have and you'll get these nodes. But you're going to start with only light output and emission, and you're going to have to add all of these things. So the first thing he added is noise texture, and he used it for the strength of the light. So whatever is black is going to have 0 strength, and whatever is white is going to have 1 as strength, and then the gray area is between those. And you can actually see it over here. So this part is black, this part is white, and then these parts are actually gray. We cannot preview area lights like we do with shaders, but I like to work with planes sometimes just so I can see the pattern that I'm creating. And then I apply that node tree to my lighting or to my area light. But what he did is add it to the strength. So I just added that to the strength. I added a noise texture. I used generated for the texture coordinate because it's just a plane. And then you can use the mapping to scale things up, to rotate things up if you want. I just moved the W, so I used a 4D texture rather than a 3D noise texture, so it can offset the noise texture rather than just changing the scale as an animation. So that will ensure that my scale doesn't change, it's just moving. So I'm just offsetting the texture as if I have a big texture that I'm just moving through. And then the second thing he did for color is instead of just leaving it as black to white, he added some color as if it's a rainbow to add some interest to the lighting, as if certain parts of the light is reflecting through glass that is creating that rainbow effect. And you can align it with the gray area, or you can just offset it a little bit, which is what I did, to get that effect in lighter areas sometimes so you can actually see it better. Again, I don't really look for realism, I just like to make art. And that has a different noise texture, but I did connect both of those to the same texture coordinate, so I didn't really have to change that, but I needed to change the scale, so I had to use another noise texture and of course another color ramp because I needed those colors in between the black and white. And then I drive the animation with a driver basically to map it from the beginning of my animation to the end of my animation, and both of these have the same driver. We can talk about driver later on, but for now this is my lighting setup. And I do have the studio lights at 0.4, so I didn't omit that because if I do put it at 0, it's quite dark. So I needed some more light, overall light. What he did is added area lights. I don't like to use a lot of area lights. I don't even know how to use a lot of area lights in my scene without overpowering the scene with too much light. So I'm not going to bother with that. And then for the shelves in the back, I used a wireframe for a cube. I did subdivide the cube in a way that I think is going to look good with a wireframe. And then I added a wireframe to it. I added an array or 2 array modifiers to get some of them to the side and then to copy that down. So I have a grid that is 4x4. And I added a base to it. And then I added also frames for each of those squares that I also multiplied with the array modifier or cloned with the array modifier. And you will get this as well in the project file as an asset. Once you add the asset, you can't really change much to it other than its position, rotation, and scale. But if you want to change the number of shelves you have and the height of the shelf, then you can just click on it on the asset that you added, then hit Command A or Control A, and just make instances real, and it'll give you back the actual mesh with all of its modifiers. Let's go back to solid view so I can view the animation. You can see over here that I have multiple hearts stacked on top of each other, and the animation will go from one side to another, and then the other heart will come in, will go back to the other side. And this is how I basically created the animation with the clamp 2 constraint. I also this year wanted to play around with some layouts, so I added some depth. Again, I learned this from Vincent Schwenk. He's one of my favorites when it comes to composition. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, or if you've created this. Play around with the curves you're moving your objects on, or the hand-drawn objects that you're creating. I'd love to see what you come up with. Okay, I'll talk to you soon. Bye!